Well, it's fascinating how oftentimes in science you can propose a way of looking at something that turns out to be very accurate, but still incorrect. And I'm thinking of classical examples like the caloric theory of heat, right? Where
Yeah.
where you can model heat as a flowing fluid and the mathematics are sound, it does work out, but there's a less complicated way of looking at that that turns out to be more physically accurate. And I
Yeah.
think that it's very easy to get lost because something is very predictive and it works out. And even technologically, you can make heat engines, right? All the basic thermodynamics were developed using this technically incorrect theory of heat, but the mathematics was sound, it was predictive, and yet it is wrong. And that's a really troubling hurdle in the whole process, the scientific method, because it doesn't prepare us for the possibility that something could be predictive and incorrect.
There's a long history of that, as you know, and um, when Newton came up with his stuff, they were calculating orbits using epicycles,
Mm-hmm.
which is a way of doing an expansion. And they had got very good at it. And it was many years before Newton's theory could do predictions that were as good as the epicycles. So they kept saying, hey, our thing works. Well, but is that what the physics is doing?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a different question from whether you could get the answer by doing that mathematics.
And it seems like you need to develop really smart experiments to distinguish between the two at some point, right? I remember with the caloric theory of heat, they eventually realized that because it was an inexhaustible substance, it couldn't actually be a substance, right? They were boring out these cannons and they could just generate infinite quantities as long as they kept boring, right? And so this contradiction, it's kind of an accidental discovery in that case. Nobody designed that experiment, but in order to separate out these sort of effects, when you have equally predictive models, you have to really, really be clever about how you discern between the two, and it's not always obvious.
The history is full of exactly that kind of thing where uh, we have two examples here. There are more. Um, what's amazing to me is that since the three theories that we rely on, electromagnetism, GR for gravitation, and quantum mechanics for atomic things, um, they were all done before any of these really precise experiments were conducted. And yet they were not, the results were not factored into the theories because the theories came first. And the
Mm-hmm.
theories came out of a very old mechanical uh, science that had been well developed. So it was the science that people knew that then got extended into this new realms. And sometimes it works. And one of the things we've learned is that you can always elaborate things mathematically to where they work. And if you're on a track, it's easier to do that than it is to start over and say, hey, maybe we had the wrong idea. Like with the caloric thing. Yeah, heat is it's a palpable thing. It's something you can imagine as a substance and it kind of acts like that. And so it was hard to give up. You know, you really had to think about things in a really new way, and that took a long time.
Yeah, it seems like it's still playing out with electricity to some extent. Like electricity is also treated as this kind of magical fluid right now, and I wonder how that paradigm will evolve in the future.
Oh, it's an excellent question. Uh, we have the same problem with that. The when quantum mechanics was being formed, they just assumed that it was the electricity that had been worked out by Maxwell and his followers. And it seemed to work. But then there was this problem when you had an atom and you had an electron around a proton in a hydrogen atom. And you could calculate the energy levels with the old original Schrodinger form, where the wave function was a physical thing in three-dimensional space. And so they calculated the lines and everything looked good. There was a reason that the transitions were quantized, because they had the stable states in the atoms and they had to go from one to the other. And that's a nice physically understandable process that Schrodinger worked out in great detail. But then if you tried to do the same thing with a helium atom, well, it's two electrons. What's the problem? Well, the problem was that the electromagnetic theory didn't work.
Mm.
So then you went back to the hydrogen atom and you realized that what the assumption had been was that this cloud of charge, which is the electron wave function, doesn't interact with itself. Well, what's that about? Has to interact with itself if it's electromagnetic. No, you just assume that electrons don't interact with themselves, but only with other electrons. Well, that's awkward. It turns out it's never been resolved. What happened instead is hydrogen found a math hack that he could put each electron in its own three-dimensional space. And then you could choose when you wanted them to interact and when you wanted them not to interact, and thereby satisfy Pauli's dictum that says electrons can't be in the same state. And we've been stuck with that 3n dimensional space ever since. So all these calculations have to be done in 3n dimensions. It gets exponential very, very worse than exponential very rapidly. Moore's law has not been able to keep up with it. So we're still making approximations to get the real energies in molecules and things. And nobody's gone back and said electromagnetism at the level of the individual wave function doesn't work the way we thought. And we have to go figure out what's there. So this theory that we thought we had so beautifully worked out is actually rotten all the way down to the core. And we have to start over there and figure out really what the interaction between two charges in when they're both electrons. And what we find out looking at, for example, superconductors and how their energies depend upon the symmetry of their wave functions, you find out that the symmetry of the wave function affects what the electrical interaction is. So it's not just the charge density, it has the wave function in it. And nobody's gone back and figured that out. So we have to go back and figure that one out.
So how do you rally people to go back to these fundamental assumptions? It seems like a continually appearing demon in science. It's so difficult to muster efforts towards reassessing fundamental assumptions. What's the best strategy for that for young people coming up? I mean, how do you find time to go back and assess these basic foundational principles?